You're listening to the first and longest running female hosted hunting podcast. Welcome to the HuntFishTravel podcast, helping you navigate your trip of a lifetime. And now, here's your hostess, Carrie Zilka.
Welcome to the HuntFishTravel podcast. I am your hostess, Carrie Zilka. And today we're talking to Drew. It's just YoungDyke, right?
Right.
Okay. Today we're talking to Drew YoungDyke. I'm going to start that over. Hold on a second, because I was like, I think that's how, but I should have checked. Hold on a second. Let me re-record this.
Sure.
Less editing. Welcome to the HuntFishTravel podcast. I am your hostess, Carrie Zilka, and today we are talking to Drew YoungDyke, who is the Senior Communications Coordinator at the National Wildlife Federation Great Lakes Regional Center. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's a wonderful organization that we will explain a little more in detail in a bit. But I got this email from the National Wildlife Federation, and it was about Asian carp and their plans to stop it. And anybody who lives in the Midwest knows what an invasive species Asian carp is. So I thought it'd be a great opportunity to have them on the show and talk about Asian carp and what exactly the National Wildlife Federation is. So, Drew, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I appreciate the opportunity.
And where are you located? You're in Michigan, correct?
Right. Our Great Lakes Regional Center office is based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, but we cover the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio.
Wow. That's a lot of territory to cover.
It is. We have staff working remotely in each of those states. We have staff in Wisconsin and in Minnesota and Ohio, and then our regional office is just located here. Of course, I grew up in northern Michigan, so it seems like almost a whole different state to be living in southern Michigan.
Gotcha. That's awesome. So so before we even jump into the Asian carp stuff, why don't we talk about the National Wildlife Federation and maybe what its purpose is for, because, I mean, I've heard, obviously as an outdoor communicator, I've heard the organization's name, I've read some press releases and stuff, but even I don't really know the ins and outs of the Federation itself.
Well, I think that's pretty common, especially within the hunting and fishing community where I come from. And that's because as a federation, what we are is kind of a national umbrella for a lot of independent state affiliate conservation organizations that may go by completely different names. For instance, in Wisconsin, our state affiliate is the Wisconsin Wildlife Federation. In Michigan, it's the Michigan United Conservation Clubs. And these are state-based organizations, and about half of them are those hunting and fishing organizations that are often the umbrellas for the local rod and gun clubs throughout the states that they cover. And so that's the way that the policy filters up to the National Wildlife Federation. A rod and gun club might introduce a resolution at the Minnesota Conservation Federation, and they might pass that resolution and introduce that at the National Wildlife Federation's annual meeting, and that becomes our policy. And that goes back to our founding. In 1936, when wildlife were in really dire straits, a guy named Ding Darling was tasked by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to assemble a Congress of different wildlife interests from all over the country. And that's when the National Wildlife Federation was formed. And then a lot of the people that came from the different states to that went back to their own states and started these statewide conservation organizations. And Ding Darling, who founded us, he was a duck hunter and actually a big critic of the president at the time. And so we were founded by a duck hunter, really assembling a multitude of voices, not just hunters and anglers, but also gardeners and bird watchers, all to kind of speak together for wildlife and provide them a national political voice to advocate for their conservation.
That's kind of a lot to take in.
Right. I guess the way that works now, though, it kind of comes back around to where you've seen since then, it seems like the conservation and environmental sides of wildlife conservation have been split. And National Wildlife Federation, what we do is at the national level, we kind of bridge that gap because we have affiliates that, are hunting and fishing organizations, and in other states we have affiliates who might be watershed groups or Audubon clubs, we're able to provide that voice in the middle that brings together both your hunter-angler conservation side and kind of more your environmental side. And so when they can agree on policy, that's what we end up advocating at the national level. So we push big things like renewing the Land and Water Conservation Fund, passing the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, big picture things like that, protecting our public lands. And that allows us to kind of work with both sides of the aisle.
Can you give me like a real-time example, other than the Asian Carp stuff, which we'll get to, but a real-life example of how the NWF has maybe either assisted local fishermen or hunters or, give me a real-time example of some of the successes that you've had working with locals.
Well, sure. Well, I think for anybody who hunts waterfowl, you can thank or blame us for the fact that you use steel shot. So our affiliates, including especially, and this was really brought by our hunting and fishing affiliates back in the 70s, they started finding out that the spent lead and lead shot was poisoning the waterfowl that they weren't trying to shoot. And so they brought those resolutions to NWF. We worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I think we even sued them at one point in the 80s to force them to move a little faster. And then they ended up adopting the non-toxic shot rules that I think they went into effect in about 1991. And so, we really spurred that, and that was something that came to us from our affiliates, like MUCC and Wisconsin Wildlife Federation and Minnesota Conservation Federation. And we do it a little bit differently now. What we push now, using the same science, but understanding that just the dynamics have changed, we actually have an effort right now where we're encouraging people to adopt non-toxic shot and, copper ammunition where it's appropriate on a voluntary basis, extending out beyond the wetlands, whether it's steel shot for grouse or something like that. So we understand that generally when you go to the hunting community and say you must do this, you're probably going to have much less success than when you just present the science, present the evidence, and saying, hey, here are the benefits if you do this. So we're kind of doing that now. And
I'm assuming that a lot of the pushback for using the non-lethal, I guess. Well,
the non-toxic is very, very lethal. But
I mean, I guess I would think that a lot of the pushback is the non-toxic shot is more expensive, and for somebody who's on a really tight budget, it could be real expensive to them, correct? Is that a lot of the pushback you get?
Yeah, that's some of it, and that's something that continues to get better. And there's an availability thing right now too. So for instance, for deer season this year, I used copper ammunition for my 30-06. I couldn't even find it for my dad's 7mm 08 or my brother's 243. So where I went, I couldn't even find it. So, so there's an availability thing, as well. But what's been happening in recent decades and recent years is the cost of the non-toxic or non-lead ammunition has been coming down, so that it's pretty comparable with your higher end lead ammunition. The accuracy is there. What it doesn't do, especially with copper ammunition, if you're hunting deer, is it doesn't break up and you don't get all those lead fragments in your meat. And that's kind of the benefit to wildlife. We've seen some news reports, I think some even out of Wisconsin, of eagles that have been brought in that have died from lead poisoning. And when we see those headlines, that's not good for hunters. When we think about what our publicity value is, when you think about what our approval is amongst the non-hunters throughout the country, those kind of headlines hurt us as a community. The more of us that adopt non-toxic when, we're hunting with calibers where we can find it, those of us that can afford it, as the cost comes down and it becomes more widely available and less expensive, the more of us that adopt that, the less of those headlines we're going to see. and the less of a hit that our approval amongst the non-hunters throughout the country is going to take.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that makes sense. Ammunition is a funny thing, and people, I don't know, as a local resident, you try to do it on the cheap, get real expensive, so I can understand people having that concern. And I cannot honestly remember ever seeing like non-lead, non-toxic. I shoot a 6.5 by 55 Swedish, and I cannot ever remember. I'm literally trying to think if I've ever even seen non-toxic shot, and I don't think I ever have.
Yeah.
So.
And that's an issue with some calibers, and that's why we're not pushing a mandatory thing with this. We're just encouraging people that can find it to adopt it as they can. Just understanding that the less lead that's in the environment, the more people do it voluntarily, the less lead that's in the environment, the fewer impacts we're going to have on non-target species. Absolutely.
Completely agree. And just over the years, I've worked with I really like the raptor rehabilitation centers, and it's absolutely heartbreaking to see these eagles and these hawks and stuff come in with lead poisoning so I get it. I think any true conservationist understands the need for something like that. But that's a great example of how you guys are actually working on our behalf. So.
Right. There's one of them. And when you look at the Land and Water Conservation Fund, that's a big push that a lot of different groups are working together on. But there's so much land that we hunt that our access was provided through the Land and Water Conservation Fund, or lakes that we fish where the boat launch was purchased by that, and projects to add additional access to, other water bodies or new lands that can be opened up for public access hunting. Those are a threat if we don't renew the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So sometimes we hear about these big national pushes, and we don't always understand how they affect hunters and anglers. But even though it might not say that right in the title, if we can get those passed, that's going to be a benefit to hunters and anglers.
Agreed. Well, cool. Well, thank you for taking the time to break all that down, because that's very helpful. You hear all these different organizations, and you kind of know what they do, sort of, but not always. But
yep, and it's weird for us because we're actually the largest nonprofit conservation organization in the country.
And you're like, membership. How do you guys not know what we do, really?
Right. But a lot of times the work that the federation doesn't just mean this one organization or people that are on our mailing list. It includes the work that you see being done by the Wisconsin Wildlife Federation or MUCC or those groups, because as they're doing work in those states, they're part of our federation and they help steer our ship. So that's why you don't always hear our name, because we're kind of a catch-all for all these groups doing good work together.
Sure. So let's transition a little. Let's segue into the whole Asian carp thing. Will you explain to the listeners, anyone who's not familiar with Asian carp, what exactly they are, where they came from, and why they're such an issue?
Absolutely. So Asian carp are a species of fish, and we generally consider 4 species of fish to be Asian carp: bighead, silver, black, and grass carp. These fish were brought over generally in the 60s and 70s in southern aquaculture facilities. And they were brought in to clean out retention ponds and that kind of thing, because what they are is they're filter feeders. So by doing that, they kind of suck up all the macroinvertebrates and that kind of stuff. But what they do is, by doing that, when they got loose and escaped into the wild waters, especially during the early 90s flooding of the Mississippi, they quickly took over these water bodies. And because they're filter feeders, because they reproduce so fast and they have very few or no natural predators in these water bodies, they eat all the base level of the food before it can filter up the species food chain in a water body. So in certain water bodies, they make up to 90% of the aquatic biomass, in that water body. So where you might have used to have, multiple different species of fish that you could catch, now there might be Asian carp and like a few or one or two others. And so it really depresses sport fishing, where commercial fishing is important on the Mississippi. It's really reduced what's available there. You see lakes like Kentucky Lake down in Kentucky and Tennessee, and Barkley Lake. Even there where it's been a trophy bass fishery, that's been really depressed. So we're trying to keep them out of getting into the Great Lakes, not just for the impact that they'll have on the Great Lakes fishery, but all the connected inland water bodies that they could access if they get in there.
That would be insane. They'd be like little cockroaches in your house. Oh my God, you just never get rid of them again, and they show up everywhere. Ugh.
Right, and the silver and the big head carp, those are kind of the most immediate concern right now, and they're the big push right now because they're about 50 miles south of Chicago. You have the Chicago area waterway system, which connects the Illinois and the Plain River, which are connected to the Mississippi. The Chicago area waterway system connects those rivers to Lake Michigan. So what's being proposed now is to redo the Brandon Road Lock and Dam, which is a choke point that would keep them from getting to Lake Michigan. And by rebuilding that, so that includes multiple different fish deterrent technologies, that would keep them from getting any closer.
That's nuts. I don't know. Over the years, you've read a lot of press releases, a lot of people you feel are, hollering about it, but I guess I never really thought about it. Yeah, if they got into Lake Michigan, oh man. We are having, we're having issues as it is with the salmon and the trout and smelt are gone, we're having issues as it is, much less introducing something like that could literally decimate our fish population no matter what the DNR could try to do.
Yeah, and the interesting thing with the Great Lakes is the U.S. Geological Survey did a study in 2017 where they looked at the food availability, because there's kind of been this underground theory of, we don't know if they'd survive in Lake Michigan because it's so cold and deep. But what they found is that at least within a mile of shore, and sometimes more, all around the entire Lake Michigan and into the Great Lakes, they would have sufficient food and habitat to survive and thrive. So when you think about where you do a lot of the fishing in Lake Michigan, when you think about even for boating recreation and summer tourism in some of those areas, and then you think about where the river mouths, where the bays, where the connected inlets are, where they're going to get inland, those are the places where they're going to thrive. So it could have a tremendous impact, not just on the Lake Michigan fishery, but on all those little connected inland lakes that really drive a lot of the local economies.
Well, sure. Even I would assume that they would have a huge impact, say, on salmon spawning. I just did an episode on salmon fishing, the fall salmon spawn and the spring or the fall salmon run, and I can imagine that would be pretty heavy competition with the Asian carp.
Right, and the way that I like to put it is they're kind of like a wedding crasher that eats the entire buffet before everybody gets up from their table.
Oh my God,
they just don't leave anything left for anybody else.
Right. That's kind of scary. I mean, okay, so explain to me. So there is like an electronic wall, correct, that you guys have built down there in Illinois. Explain to me how that all came about and how that works, because obviously I'm calling it an electronic wall. I don't exactly know what it is.
Sure. So just, the National Wildlife Federation hasn't built any of this. We're an advocacy group, just like, just like the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation or something like that. So we'll advocate. We're saying, we'll organize a public support campaign for Congress to approve this funding. It's the Army Corps of Engineers that does the construction. So they have some existing electric barriers in this waterway. The problem is the fish keep getting past these electric barriers. Not a lot of them, but, a few here or there, enough to show us that we need more. So what they would do is rebuild this lock and dam. And then as part of this lock and dam, there'll be an engineered channel. And within that channel, they'll have an electric barrier similar to what they currently have. But then they'll also add, it's almost like a bubble curtain within the water that provides a visual, audio, and physical deterrent to the fish. They'll include acoustic deterrent that's like an underwater sound system, basically, because Asian carp, silver carp, are the ones that you'll see jump out of the water when they're disturbed by boat motors. That's because they're sensitive to underwater acoustics. So this would use that sensitivity against them to drive them away, to keep them out of this. And then if any of the eggs or even the small ones got past that, the actual lock that the navigational vessels would be in gets flushed out. And so that water gets flushed out so that no fish make it past there either. So when you add all those different levels of deterrence to an existing, to an electric barrier, then you greatly increase its effectiveness. Whereas right now, they probably have about a third of a chance of getting into the Great Lakes. If this is built, then that chance will dramatically drop.
Wow. Sounds pretty complex.
It is, but the way that we describe it is it's just a gauntlet, right? We just make this engineered channel because they can't shut down navigation. That's been suggested that'll never happen. So they've had to look at alternatives that would keep navigation open. Basically, they're building a gauntlet and throwing a whole bunch of barriers where if they make it past this one, they'll get stopped by the next one. If they get past that one, they'll get stopped by the next one. And you're right. You have heard a lot about this over the last 10 years or so. And really, this is a culmination of that 10-year process. When they identified that there was eDNA and the potential for fish to get past those barriers, those existing barriers, they started this process of, okay, where are the areas where they can get into the Great Lakes? They've closed a few of those already, St. Anthony Falls Lock and Dam in Minnesota and the Eagle Marsh Berm in Indiana. So they've already done a couple of these projects, but this is the most critical pathway. And this is really our one shot to get something stronger into that pathway to keep them out of Lake Michigan.
So what do you think that, say, I, as a fisherman, what can I do other than just donating to organizations like yours? What can I do to help prevent the spread of the Asian carp?
Well, as an individual, as you're out there, for any anglers that are using bait, making sure that you're not transferring bait between watersheds. So there's small Asian carp that you want to make sure never end up in your bait buckets that you transfer from one watershed to another. It's illegal to transfer those, so make sure you know what you're buying. But from an advocacy standpoint, the biggest thing is support for this project. It's going to carry a huge price tag. Right now, they're estimating it will cost $778 billion.
That's so much.
Or sorry, $778 million.
But still so much.
Right. But when you consider what's at stake, it's a $7 billion annual sport fishery. So you're talking about spending $778 million at once to protect a $7 billion annual sport fishery. So the economics still make sense, but we need to convince Congress that it makes sense. So right now what's happening is the Army Corps of Engineers has released its final, what they call a chief's report. It's like its final report to Congress. So they've got a draft of that out for public comment. We've actually are organizing hunter angler groups to sign on to a comment letter in support of that. So if you're a member of a local fishing club, a local rod and gun club, they contact the Wisconsin Wildlife Federation, or you can contact me if you put my contact information up on show notes, and let us know that your group wants to support that letter, and we'll sign you on to that letter, and that helps provide support to the Corps to move forward with it. And then what we need is just people to call their congressmen, call their senators, and say, we support this plan, we support you funding and approving it, because that's really what it's going to come down to. Once the Corps finishes up this report, they're going to present it to Congress in February of 2019, and it can't move forward unless Congress says we approve it and here's the funds to do it. So that's what we need, and we need the Illinois DNR and the governor of Illinois to sign on and support as a local sponsor too. So we really just need people to call their elected officials and say, support this project.
Gotcha. That makes sense, and I would think that that's easy to do, and I would definitely include the contact information in the show notes of this episode. Sounds like you have your hands full, even just with this one project.
Well, where I grew up in northern Michigan, it's right where Asian carp would probably have one of the biggest impact, and representative of a lot of different communities around the Great Lakes region that are similar. I grew up in a small town of 900 people, about 6 miles from Lake Michigan, right in the middle of a chain of inland lakes. I grew up fishing with my grandpa. We'd fish for pike, especially trolling. Now I'm more of an unsuccessful trout angler with a fly rod. But when you grow up in those areas, you see what tourism and what fishing recreational tourism does for that community. Town I grew up in, there's maybe 900 people total, but the town would triple in the summer, and all the local businesses made their year from people that came to our town to either stay in a cabin on the lake and water ski, or people that came up to fish. And those are the exact type of activities that would be damaged irreparably if Asian carp made it into these waters. So, it's a lot of work, and we got a big coalition. We work with Trout Unlimited and Ducks Unlimited as well in stopping this. But it's very personal for me because I know exactly what will happen to these towns if these fish make it in there. They won't exist. They'll be ghost towns.
I think sometimes when people, they see, I don't know, when you throw out terms like sport fishing or whatever, where, like it says, across the country, Asian carp are undermining our nation's fisheries and threaten the Great Lakes $7 billion annual sport fishery. I think when people hear terms like that, they're thinking of just the fishing church. So they're like, oh, who cares? It doesn't affect me. But it does affect you, because just using the salmon fishing, for example, in the fall, I go down there, I hang out at the marina, I do some fishing, and then I go to the local restaurant and I have a meal and I have a couple beers and I'm supporting, the waitress, I'm tipping her, whatever. If there's no reason for me to go down there, then there's no reason for me to go to that restaurant, on a whim. It really does have a huge trickle-down effect, and it does affect everybody.
Absolutely. And in my hometown, you rent a cabin. There's the people that clean the cabin, the people that own them. Maybe you bring your own boat, but maybe you rent it. You're going to stop at the marina to fill up your boat with gas. You got the marina attendant there. You're gonna buy some stuff from the grocery store for some sandwiches to take out in the cooler. You're gonna buy some tackle from the bait shop.
Yeah,
that's the entire town economy, and that's one small, less than 1,000 person town. But there's hundreds and thousands of these towns and these communities all across the region that would be affected in the same way.
Absolutely. I can't even imagine. I'm a big sturgeon spear. Everybody knows this, how I fangirl over sturgeon. And, Lake Winnebago was one of the greatest success stories in Wisconsin with the reintroduction of these lake sturgeon, who are also bottom feeders, who would be in direct competition with these carp. And I just can't even imagine the impact that would have to the hard work that's been put in the last 30, 40, 50 years, to these fish. And
right.
Sturgeon spearing weekend's a huge I can't even imagine if there was no sturgeon spearing weekend, a city like Fond du Lac would really be hurting. It's got a huge trickle-down effect.
The same with Sheboygan in northern Michigan. They have a very limited sturgeon spearing season. It's called the Chivalry. And they'll only allow, some years they might only allow 2, and as soon as the first 2 have been speared, the season shuts down. But the whole town just fills up with everybody coming in for this. There might only be 2 people that actually get to spear a sturgeon that year. But that town, in the middle of winter, when the only other thing you have going on is snowmobile traffic and tourism, you have people just flooding this town and making the winter for these local businesses because of those 2 sturgeon that get to be speared.
Yep. Exactly. It's amazing. And I can't even imagine what the impact on sturgeon. There's so much. There's actually a lot of concern, more than I thought there would be, like, for me personally. And that's just being honest. I didn't realize until we had this conversation, which is why I like doing these episodes.
it's not something I was really aware of until about 10 years ago, and I was actually finishing up law school, and I did my kind of final paper on the lawsuits when Michigan and Wisconsin tried to sue Illinois to shut down the locks over Asian carp. And I was just a guy that liked to go out and fish a little bit. I wasn't even in the conservation field. But doing that paper, I saw how important this was. So for the last 9 years, through about 3 different organizations I've worked for, this has been the dominant issue that's kind of tied all those together.
Yeah. Pretty crazy. So, Drew, tell me a little bit, how did you even get involved in all this stuff? Like, how did you come to work for this organization?
Well, as I mentioned out of law school, I did my final paper on the Asian Carp lawsuits. That led into an internship with the Michigan League of Conservation Voters, and I was thinking maybe that internship would introduce me to some environmental law firms I might be able to work for. And then I found I actually just liked advocacy better. So because I've always hunted and fished, I ended up going to work for the Michigan United Conservation Clubs, which is, as I mentioned, the state affiliate for National Wildlife Federation, and it's the Michigan statewide umbrella for all the local rod and gun clubs in Michigan. So we'd advocate for statewide policy, protecting hunting and fishing rights, but also advocating for fish and wildlife conservation through state policy. And there I ran an on-the-ground volunteer program, improving wildlife habitat, led a statewide ballot initiative on wolf hunting of all things, and that eventually I ended up being the editor of Michigan Out of Doors magazine, and the opportunity came to work for the National Wildlife Federation, doing communications, and I kind of saw that as that opportunity to work on a more national scale, which I've been looking for, but also a place where you can kind of try to bridge that gap, as I mentioned, between the hunting, fishing, conservation side and the environmental side. Because when you look at where hunter numbers are going, we're not always going to be able to sustain what we do on our own without help. So we need to make friends. And when we look at wildlife conservation, what they're going to require, if hunting licenses continue to drop, the conservation funding for that is going to go down. We need to find that conservation funding from another source. So the way I look at it, hunter angler conservationists and kind of environmentalists need to find a way to work together for the benefit of wildlife that we all use. And I look at this as a place where I can do that.
Excellent. Very cool. All right. Well, why don't you tell the listeners how they can find you on social media and where they can go to find more information about the National Wildlife Federation?
Sure. So you can follow our Great Lakes Regional Center at NWF Great Lakes on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can follow our sportsmen's work across the country at NWF Sportsman on Twitter. On Instagram as well. And then I actually host a podcast too for National Wildlife Federation called Conservation Country. So you can find that on iTunes, Stitcher, and Podbean. So you can find all of those, and you can always go to our website at nwf.org to see what we do nationally as well.
Wonderful. Excellent. All right, and I will be sure to link all this in the show notes, and which they'll be able to find at www.ocz.net or huntfishtravel.net. Just find the episode, and in the iTunes and the Stitcher Radio show notes, they should be able to click right through and get a hold of you and find out what you're up to.
All right.
And that'll do it. Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot. You can find me on Twitter, Carrie Zylka, CarrieZylka. You can find me on Facebook. You can send me a friend request. You can follow the HuntFishTravel page on Facebook as well. Just search HuntFishTravel. I'm pretty much everywhere. Any social media. So go find me. Say hi. And if you found value in this episode, head over to iTunes or Stitcher Radio and leave me a 5-star review and a comment, if you would. Alternatively, if you'd like to support the show, you can check out my Patreon page, patreon.com/HuntFishTravel, all one word. Donate $1, you buy me a cup of coffee. And thank you for your support.